Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay back there? Great, thank you. Welcome, everybody. My name is Carol Cohn. I'm the director of the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights, and we're really happy to have you with us today, both here in the room and on Zoom. For those of you on Zoom, the chat is now on. Please introduce yourselves if you feel like it, and it'll come on again at the end. Also, when you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function. And when you leave the Zoom, a short survey will pop up, which we would be grateful if you give us feedback. Those of you in the room, you also have that survey on your seats, and you had it on the QR codes. And again, we'd really appreciate your feedback. Before introducing today's speaker, I want to open first by situating us in this place, UMass Boston, which was built on the unceded homelands of the indigenous Massachusetts people, and by honoring the diverse indigenous peoples' enduring relationships with their traditional territories, and by foregrounding the fact that the way land has passed from indigenous to non-indigenous control is through a violent history of genocide and forced removal, and the death, dispossession, and displacement of countless people and communities, processes that are still going on today. I'd also like to emphasize that land acknowledgements by themselves don't do that much, and they really need to be followed up with other forms of action and solidarity. Our event today is the fourth talk in a 2-semester-long speaker series on climate breakdown and the war system that the consortium has organized in collaboration with the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, with support from an affirming multivocal humanities grant from the Mellon Foundation. So I first want to extend my warm thanks to the department and to Dr. Amani L. Jack for this collaboration. I also want to thank the gratifyingly large numbers of departments, programs, centers, and offices at UMass who are co-sponsoring this series. We really, you can see them on the screen, we really could not do this without their support. My thanks also go to the many wonderful consortium interns, UMass student volunteers, and the consortium's program associate, Claire Kendrick, who've played key roles in putting this whole speaker series on, making the events go smoothly. And finally, I want to express my profound appreciation to a consortium intern, Alinka Drondo, who's been my partner in conceptualizing and organizing this series. So now, 2 minutes more before we get to introducing our speaker. In the second semester of this year's series on climate breakdown on the war system, we are focusing on militaries, policing, AI, and struggles for justice. And now, I think if we're talking about the war system, we have to start now by acknowledging that this is the 11th day since Trump and Netanyahu started launching attacks against Iran in a war that is now spread to multiple other countries in the Middle East. At this point, it's really hard to talk about the costs. The costs in human life and suffering are as yet incalculable and untold. The ecological costs at this point are also incalculable. But let me just say, for instance, regarding fuel use, we know that the US military in peacetime uses 12,600,000 gallons of fuel per day. In war, it is massively more. For example, right now we are told there are 200 fighter jets from the US involved in this war. One kind of those fighter jets, an F-15, burns through about 2,000 gallons of gas in, anybody want to guess how long that takes them? No courageous guesses. Okay, as little as 6 to 10 minutes. About the financial costs of this war, and remember, financial costs are always opportunity costs, right? For example, money that you could spend feeding people or trying to mitigate climate change. US Republican lawmakers have said that they think the Pentagon is spending close to $2 billion a day on this war. And so 60 days would be about 60 billion, although the costs are estimated to go down per day toward the end of the war. So some estimate that the overall cost of the war will be about 65 billion. Again, these are just estimates. We don't know how long the war is going to go on. However, what we do know is that the Pentagon has already reportedly put together a $50 billion supplemental budget request to replace the Tomahawk, Patriot, and missiles and THAAD interceptors already used in the first week of the war. 50 billion. Of course, where does that money come from? Congress allocates it, and it comes from taxpayers. So to put that, again, that big number into context, the DOGE cuts in the beginning of the Trump administration, those verifiable cuts have been no more than 2 billion. That's one more day of the war, and think about all the destruction that those cuts involved. The Trump administration cuts to the SNAP program, which helps 1 in 8 Americans, 70% of whom are elderly, disabled, or children, buy food each month. Those cuts are about 18.6 billion per year. So that $50 billion supplemental spending bill for the first week of the war could feed all those people for about 2 2/3 of a year. And one other thing to contextualize that number, Trump's tax cuts of 2025 left the top 1% of Americans, richest 1% of Americans, were projected to receive about $117 billion in tax cuts. So the amount of money that they are getting in bonus tax cuts could fund 2 of these wars, should one want to do that. Okay, so the war, that they're talking about war and the war system, also talking about climate, its relation to climate, a very conservative estimate, which comes from Securing America's Future Energy, which is a nonpartisan national security organization led by retired military officers, senior military officers. They estimate that in peacetime, about 1/5 of the Pentagon budget exists to keep oil flowing through vulnerable choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, which you've been hearing a lot about, the Suez Canal, and shipping lanes in the South China Sea. That's more than $81 billion every year to protect the global flow of oil. The other thing to say about climate, of course, is that Trump has banned it from climate change has been banned from government discourse, government policy, and so on. And so it may seem strange to be talking about a military green transition when in our country, supposedly, there's no need for it. But in fact, the US military has been very worried about climate change for quite a long time and has been talking about this actually long before the government did. Okay, having said all of that as background, today I am really excited to be able to introduce you to Dr. Nico Edwards, who's going to help us better understand how militaries and arms industries are increasingly presenting themselves as climate leaders, promoting greener technologies and climate-friendly reforms, and how these projects recast militarization as environmental progress, normalizing armed violence and war-making in the name of protecting the planet. Dr. Edwards is, I keep on saying Dr. Edwards with emphasis because it's brand new, this doctorate. We should all really give her a hand. Dr. Edwards is a postdoctoral research associate at the War and Geos Project at Newcastle University. Her doctoral research, which you will get to hear about today, examined the drivers of the defense and security sector's environmental sustainability pivot, and asks what the military green transition means in practice for eco-social justice. Her background is in international humanitarian law, political economy, and interdisciplinary peace and security studies. After graduating with her master's from SOAS University of London and before her PhD from the University of Sussex, she worked in policy research, parliamentary advocacy, and communitarian journalism, working with civil society organizations such as Parliamentarians for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament, La Otra Juventud from Colombia, and Peaceworks Sweden. Her writing and research have been published across both academic and public-facing venues. Among the important publications that you might want to check out, she's the author of the World Peace Foundation's report, Resisting Green Militarism, Building Movements for Peace and Eco-Social Justice. So I am so happy to have her here come talk with us today. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Thanks so much, Carol. Now I'm going to do this wonderful screen share swap. Let's see how the technology works out. That's the issue. There we are. Everyone can see that? Yeah. Can everyone hear me okay? Back of the room, Zoom, hopefully. Great, that's great. Thanks so much, Carol, for this wonderful invitation and also for having me here as my first lecture as a 1-week-old doctor. I'm newly born. Thank you so much. And I'm really excited to have been invited to this important speaker series. And I'm also very grateful for all the labor that goes into making this possible, because it's a huge machinery and we are all the better for it. Can war be environmentally sustainable? Well, this provocation has stuck with me ever since I learned at a webinar in 2020 that arms companies had started developing so-called environmentally friendly weapons. Like, imagine green bombs that use biodegradable explosives or renewable attack drones that are run on solar-powered energy. And this suggestion of more sustainable forms of war, right, opened this whole Pandora's box of questions for me. For instance, as to the nature of war, as to war's relationship to nature, and as to the purpose of military activity. And in particular, it made me wonder what is left of ecological care if this is now something that militaries do, right? If ecological protection had become something that the world's worst polluting and most destructive, ecologically destructive forces were now in charge of. And this conundrum is what we'll dig into in this talk, and we'll do so across 3 sections. I'll first give a little background to my doctoral research at the University of Sussex in the UK. That will give you some keys to think through today's topic, the way I think through it. There are obviously several ways to think through it. And then we'll look at specific examples of military climate governance work or mitigation and adaptation measures, focusing on the 4 major climate governance roles that I think military climate strategies assign military sectors, but also the 4 major pillars of military decarbonization that are being suggested in the same goal. And finally, I'll take you through 4 key critiques as well. It seems like I like the figure 4. Now, in the years since 2020, military actors across Europe have been working really hard to gain recognition as allies in the so-called fight against climate collapse. And this might, as you already heard from Carol, sound a bit surprising to many of you in this US context, right? With Trump's so-called Trump's purge of all so-called climate crap, right, from Pentagon and other government activity. But while Trump has denounced any form of military climate work as essentially a threat to the lethality of the US warfighter, European military sectors, so militaries and arms companies and all other beneficiaries around them, have gone in the opposite direction. Instead, defense ministries, arms companies, armies, navies, and air forces across Europe are increasingly presenting themselves as ecologically responsible actors who not only, quote, keep people and society safe, as you see in the image, but who are also putting sustainability in action by effectively combating climate change and driving green and social transition. And what are these claims based on, right? What does military climate action look like? And what relations of power, harm, violence, and insecurity effectively hide behind these military pledges, right, as actors who protect both people and planet? And to try to answer these questions in my doctoral research, I've spent the past 3 years reading hundreds and hundreds of military climate policy documents and arms company marketing materials. I've been interviewing representatives of the armed forces, arms industry, academia, and civil society, as well as conducting ethnographic research in arms fairs. And these fairs are essentially huge conference spaces where all actors who benefit from the war system in different ways and who enable it come together to trade weapons. So it's a really fascinating place to be in. And at these fairs, I, for instance, attended panels on military sustainability programs and met hundreds of military businessmen. And combining data from these contexts, I've been mapping European military sectors, foremost the UK's narrative and practical proposals for governing climate change effects, and for decarbonizing or greening in different ways, military operations and equipment. Instead of accepting these proposals, however, as somehow progressive developments, right, in military policy and practice, as sort of positive developments, I connect them to militaries and arms industry's central roles as preservers of global militarist, extractivist, and imperial social and ecological relations. That is, as preservers of the very systemic conditions that have brought about ecological collapse to begin with. And by militarism, I'll just have a little back to basics rundown of these terms. By militarism, I refer to the many processes that make the buildup, threat, and use of military violence socially and materially possible, including loads of attitudes and practices, right, that make war a rational, desirable, and even profitable social activity. And in turn, the preparation and conduct of war would not be possible without the large-scale extraction, consumption, and destruction of the Earth's resources, and not only the Earth's resources, but also outer space resources at this point. And this is where extractivism comes in, right? Broadly defined as logics and practices that enable the violent, non-reciprocal, and unsustainable extraction and distribution of land and raw materials. And militarism and extractivism are both core conditions, right, within the larger system or systemic context of imperialism. Imperialisms are different kinds. And global imperial power relations, in which we see certain states and allied actors like large corporations build influence and wealth by ensuring access to or control over territories and peoples. And this control is often violently seized and maintained through dispossessing or exploiting its foremost indigenous, racialized, and low-income communities across the global north and south. And I've spent a minute defining these terms, as I'd like you to keep in mind that these are the violent, uneven systemic contexts or conditions and relations on which European states depend to build their military power, as well as to decarbonize it. And that will become a little clearer throughout the presentation. And I also argue that it's in the name of preserving these power relations that actors like NATO, the EU, the European Union, the UK, France, and Germany are now adapting their militaries to ecological collapse and effectively trying to green war. Finally, it's also important to note, I won't touch on this much in the presentation, but it's good to bear in mind as well that these power relations are, of course, also deeply gendered and racialized. Militarist, extractivist, and imperial relations in the European context rely on the differentiation and consequent exploitation, right, of social groups who are presented as inferior to masculinity and whiteness in different ways. And this involves the normalization of hypermasculine ideals like strength, self-sufficiency, technological determinism, and domination. And I've become acutely aware of this politics of differentiation and just how much power it has during this fieldwork in NATO-oriented arms fairs that consist of a majority of white men who seek status through money, violence, and sexual abuse. So with this backdrop in mind, what does military climate action look like? Well, military actors have, as Carol also mentioned, a long history of climate environmental engagements, including the generation of deeply problematic climate-related threat assessments that were mentioned in Todd Miller's lecture back in November. And in the European context, this history has culminated in the recent years in the publication and early implementation of more than 100 military climate strategies, some of which you can see here in the slide. And these strategies, to me, promote two key messages or narratives. First, that European military power must be repurposed, expanded, and mobilized to address the violence and volatility, right, that is assumed to spread with climate change, ecological degradation, and the military, also the military, the green industrial transition writ large. And secondly, that European warfighting superiority must be ensured through operational adaptation. And to achieve these goals, I argue that the strategies assign military sectors four major climate governance roles and responsibilities. There are, of course, other roles and responsibilities, but I think these are the primary four. And I summarize them as the climate warrior, humanitarian first responder, the natural conservationist, and the net zero champion. And first off, a key emerging representation, right, of militaries and their industrial suppliers of different kinds, their weapons suppliers, is that of the climate warrior. And I haven't made up this term, as you can see. It's a term that they use for themselves. And this framing is, we can think of it as the overarching narrative or overarching or underpinning narrative through which all of the military's roles in climate adaptation sort of is made sense of and informed. And these warriors combat climate change, right? They also use that term a lot by decarbonizing, for instance, by decarbonizing warfare or through biodiversity protection. They also wage a war on climate change effects, such as through deploying in the context of extreme weathers. Foremost, however, they maintain European states' national energy and supply chain security in the face of a wide range of reductively sort of defined climate-induced threats, including climate conflicts and climate wars, but also terrorism, mass migration, and global competition over green transition resources. And this warrior framing, I think, again, demonstrates the militarized, masculinist, and racialized worldviews through which military actors often conceive of climate change effects and responses, foregrounding, for instance, coercion, threat, and force over mutual vulnerability, care, and cooperation. And this is often mobilized to protect European interests against so-called threatening non-European populations. And the climate warrior is closely linked with the second military climate governance role, right? That of the first responder to disasters. As floods, storms, heat waves, and droughts with ensuing wildfires become more common and severe, right? Military climate strategies anticipate that European militaries will have to deploy a lot more frequently and at a much larger scale to provide humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And this, of course, we're already seeing plenty in the United States and in many parts of the global South. And the militarized framing of climate insecurity surfaces here again, such as seen in military strategists' tendency to approach especially wildfires as if they were actually wars. We're at war with wildfires. Are militaries prepared? Asks a US strategist, Aaron Sikorsky, that we can see in the image. Meanwhile, the mayor of Marseille recently proclaimed the Marine Firefighter Battalion is waging guerrilla warfare, hoses in hand. And I think the increase in military deployments to tackle climate-related disasters, it does, of course, reflect the fact that military institutions and infrastructures are today's most logistically capable forces. And this is the argument that we are being pounded with as well from sort of military actors, right? That there is no other choice. But I think it's really important to recognize that this is not an apolitical or natural condition, right? Rather, it's the result of generations of uneven investment in military versus civilian or grassroots response mechanisms, or in mitigating climate change effects to begin with. And it's also the result of the continued rationalization, right, of militaries and military institutions and weapons as the only viable guarantors of security in contemporary society. So that's, I think, part of the militarization of the mind, if you like. And by normalizing military actors as self-evident disaster responders, military climate strategies effectively normalize war makers as aid workers, while turning climate change effects into pretexts for expanding military mandates, missions, and troops and resources, despite their ongoing contribution to collapse. And in contrast, I think it's worth mentioning that scholars and affected populations across the globe are instead evidencing in many ways that the most effective disaster responders are often coalitions of grassroots-based, locally rooted organizers and communities, such as seen with certain responses during Hurricane Katrina here in the US, but we also have key examples from major disasters in Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. And often participating in these disaster responses is also indigenous communities who are rooted really in those lands. Let's see where we're at. Now, onto another, to me, really fascinating climate governance role, and which is especially important to military claims as climate actors as we speak, and that's the natural conservationist. And military sectors are effectively the largest landowners, and I see a lot of people laughing. I love that. That my slides are doing their job. the military sectors are effectively the largest landowners in many NATO and EU states, occupying lands both domestically and across the global networks of bases and joint training areas. And the US Department of Defense, or War, I don't know what you call it these days, controls nearly 30 million acres of land worldwide, spanning 45 countries and 8 so-called US territories, which are often still colonial territories. And similarly, the UK Ministry of Defense is the country's second largest landowner, controlling 2,000 domestic and around 145 military bases worldwide, and managing more than 340,000 hectares in the UK alone. And among these hectares, you find 13 national parks, because militaries are great at that. And demonstrating the importance of military land use, I think, to the preservation of imperial global order, what we can see is that both the UK and the US occupy training areas and support bases in past or present colonial territories, right? Like Guam, Cuba, Cyprus, Kenya, Brunei, and Oman, with a range of other sites as well. And given this land ownership, military actors have long promoted themselves as environmental stewards who successfully balance military training and weapons production with biodiversity protection. And this is a form of military conservation, which British geographer Rachel Woodward calls khaki conservation, which I think is quite suiting, of particular importance to their present climate claims, right? And by example, the British arms company Kinetic that we see in the picture here argues that it carefully combines the development of heavy weapons, such as hypersonic missiles and directed energy weapons, with protecting woodlarks, orchids, reptiles, highland cattle, and damselflies on MOD estates. Our sustainability appraisal approach, boasts Kinetic, ensures we're able to effectively balance complex trials with careful protection of rare flora and fauna. And again, Rachel Woodward, the British geographer, argues that this representation, right, of military land use or military land management as somehow unique and essential forms of ecological protection is integral to government's justification of the military control of large areas of national and overseas territories. And it also, I think, contributes to the ongoing ethical washing, right, of the war system by promoting environmental sustainability or ecological protection, biodiversity protection, as a legitimate and appropriate military activity, as something that we can let the military be in charge of. And in reality, the representation of military lands as wild and plant life sanctuaries invisibilize the multi-generational contamination from military training, testing, and weapons stockpiling for which military states are effectively used. And this contamination includes explosive weapons, explosive munitions with all the heavy metals and chemicals that come with, radioactive wastes, jet propulsion, and fire retardants with forever chemicals such as PFAS, which is there are loads and loads of controversial cases now across the US, but also in Europe with the use of PFAS. And indigenous populations have historically, again, been worst affected by the ecological damage of military land use. Also because military land use has this clear relationship to settler colonialism, right? And we've seen this especially clearly with the development and testing of the US, UK, and France nuclear weapons, and which happened specifically on native lands in Algiers, the Marshall Islands, and New Mexico and Navajo Nation here in the US. And strikingly, the UK and France, for instance, at the moment are currently promoting their military conservation efforts next to modernizing and effectively expanding their nuclear weapons arsenals. Now to the fourth major role of importance to military sustainability claims, and that's the role of the net zero champion. Military's and arms industry's appetite for fossil fuels, as we heard in Carol's introduction, is a crucial impediment to global climate mitigation, and increasingly also to their own operations and activities. And if the world's militaries, just to give you an idea, not only of the US use, but also globally, if the world's militaries were a country, their carbon footprint would rank the fourth largest in the world. And the US DoD, as we know, is the world's largest institutional consumer and thus emitter of carbon and consumer of fossil fuels. But the UK MOD, similarly, of course, on a smaller scale, but equally important to people and planet, the UK MOD produces about 75% of the UK government's central emissions, which is a huge piece for any one government institution or department to be accountable for. And in a single year, the MOD burned roughly 666 million liters of fuel to operate their military aircraft. And this is equivalent to around the annual fuel use of around 850,000 passenger cars, just to give you something to compare with. And military climate strategists they recognize that dwindling fossil fuel access, global energy shifts, and so-called net zero legal requirements will affect their ability to procure weapons and to wage war, right? And in response, they're increasingly positioning themselves as net zero champions who pursue emission reduction and energy diversification programs of different kinds, and who are central to the government's sort of struggle in decarbonizing its broader activities. And as declared by the UK's Director of Future Combat Air, together we are charting a course towards a safer, more sustainable, and more interconnected world, while playing a pivotal role in realizing the Royal Air Force's net zero vision. And indeed, the British Air Force has pledged to become, quote, the first net zero Air Force by 2040, which is a really hefty task. But what does this mean in material terms? Well, this leads us to the growing number of technological proposals for decarbonizing war and equipment and operations. Militaries and arms companies conduct a range of activities to reduce the ecological impact of their estates and also of sort of the production phase of arms, so at weapons factories. But for this presentation, I'm more interested in how they propose to green technologies for military end use. That is, the ways in which they're innovating greener means of killing, maiming, and destroying during operations and battle. And the four major pillars of sustainable warfare that I've identified, I'm sure there are plenty more, but these are the major ones that I've looked at in my research, comprise the electric, digital, and alternative fuel transformation of equipment and operations, all powered by lower carbon energy sources, to which military actors count nuclear energy, right? Which I think in itself is a sign of just how unsustainable their sustainable activities are. But there's, of course, a broader debate on nuclear energy. And firstly, electrification refers to the process of replacing technologies that rely on the combustion of hydrocarbons, right, with electrically powered equivalents. And to this end, the British Army looks to become, quote, a more effective and greener army that champions sustainability through developing an electrically powered force. And this force might deploy hybrid electric tanks alongside all electric drones powered by solar energy or hydrogen fuel cells. And my favorite example of these electrified battle dreams, however, is the directed energy weapon. I'm not sure if you've heard about this weapon, but this is really the talk of the town in the global defense community at the moment. And as an arms salesman explained to me at an arms fair, this weapon has great sustainability benefits, since the directed energy weapon, or the directed energy that it's used to destroy targets, right, instead of kinetic processes that use explosives, it directs this energy by using electricity. And this electricity can be derived from lower carbon energy or renewable energy sources. And this arms fair was also an arms fair dedicated to the theme of sustainable security. But when I stepped in there, I was the only person who effectively asked the question on sustainability. So I think that tells us something as well. And arms companies like Babcock, Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, and Rolls-Royce, alongside a vast array of smaller tech developers like AeroVironment and Heaven Aerotech, are all developing different kinds of electrified weapon systems and solutions for the military at the moment. And these weapons are celebrated for combining, quote, environmental friendliness with operational benefits like reduced noise and increased endurance. And I think this is obviously a narrative that perfectly captures the really troubling suggestion, right, that sustainability and warfighting are compatible projects. And electrification is also closely linked to digitalization, since autonomous weapons that operate without a crew are more easily electrified. And in essence, battlefield digitalization involves the increased adoption of robotics, autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to facilitate a so-called data-centric approach to warfare. And this approach has alleged sustainability benefits, such as by reducing the amount of troops, inventory, and fuel that you need to transport and use at the battlefield. And military actors describes force digitalization, I think, in really fascinating and terrifying ways. On this battlefield, you'll find dispersed human troops operating or plugged into digital combat clouds, as you can see here in the picture. I haven't come up with that term either. Operating in tandem with electrically propelled, AI-driven strike drones and swarms of loitering suicide munitions, some of which we've seen loads extensively in Ukraine and Russia. And these human machine teams might be backed by a land-borne combat fleet consisting of fully digitalized hybrid propulsion tanks. I can't even pronounce this word. With at-sea strike reinforcement from autonomous electric drives, sea gliders, and submarines. And if this technical jargon, dripping with that hyper-masculine, I think, obsession with force and technology annoyed you at all, I'm happy. Because this is a perfect example of what Carol described in her article on US nuclear strategists as the techno-strategic discourse, right, that military actors use to effectively obscure the bloody, embodied, and ecological effects of the policies that they implement or the weapons that they trade. And plans to digitally transform military operations also evidence the centrality of big business, right, and of corporate power to the military twin digital and green transition, because these digitalization and decarbonization in various ways are always thought of as synonymous processes. And big tech and big data platforms like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, Palantir, and Anduril. Some of these, I think, are even Lord of the Rings names, because this is how the big tech nerds work. These actors also have growing presences in the arms fairs that I have attended the past 3 years. And they're becoming crucial military industrial actors, right? Transforming military policy, procurement, and budgeting practices, as well as the very physical and moral character of military violence and war in various ways. And we're seeing the consequences of this shift towards the algorithmization of war, with the US and Israel's use of AI-driven targeting software currently to bomb Iran and Lebanon, but also extensively during the Gaza genocide. And I find it really striking that these same actors now are indeed becoming integral also to militaries and arms companies' attempts to green weapons and warfare and to their claims as climate actors in various ways. And thirdly, in terms of decarbonization, military decarbonization, because the most carbon-intensive military capabilities involve large-scale platforms like warships, fighter jets, and combat tanks, many of the military sector's green claims revolve around the development of alternative or so-called sustainable fuels, right? And among these domains, air power is the most fuel and carbon intensive, as we heard also from Carol's introduction. And the development of sustainable aviation fuels is thus a very hot topic among European military sectors, which is something that an arms sustainability lead told me in an interview. And 50-50 sustainable conventional fuel blends, they can't do more at the moment. They've tried once with 100% sustainable fuels, but they stopped for different reasons. But so 50-50 sustainable conventional fuel blends are currently being tested for major combat aircraft, like the US-led F-35 and F-16, but also the the Eurofighter Typhoon, which is developed mostly by European weapons developers and states. In short, picture this: an F-35 powered by household wastes. It could be your household waste. Great place to put your waste. Animal fats, biomass from forestry residues, or vegetable oils of different kinds. And I think just to emphasize how perverse, at least to me, the idea of making these fighter jets sustainable is, both the F-35 and the F-16 are known as the genocide jets because of their centrality to Israel's bombing of Gaza. Meanwhile, the Typhoon has been crucial to the Saudi-led and Western-backed bombing or destruction and bombing campaign of Yemen for years and years. And finally, the fourth pillar of military decarbonization, I think of great interest, but that I won't linger on very long. To reduce the operational reliance on fossil fuels, military sectors are ramping up their efforts to diversify their energy sources, right? So next to hydrocarbons, they're now also expanding their use of wind, solar, hydrogen, mostly what they call green hydrogen, and nuclear power. However, like with the wider societal shift, right, towards non-hydrocarbon energy systems, where we're seeing the accumulation effectively of more energy sources to keep powering our global growth economy, what we can also call green capitalism or capitalism in repair mode, the military's uptake in lower carbon sources is not replacing, but rather adding to their fossil fuel consumption, right? So we're not seeing a shift in that sense. We're seeing an expansion of energy use. This is one of my favorite pictures from fieldwork that I'll bring with me forever. Kongsberg is the Norway's largest weapons manufacturer, which is also one of the largest in the world. And now, with these four categories of operational decarbonization in mind, I argue that what we're being sold, right, we're being sold a lot of things. But one deeply problematic narrative is the one that ecological sustainability and warfighting readiness go hand in hand. Right? That efforts to address the climate environmental impacts of war are compatible with rather than critiques of militarization. And these green war proposals also reveal a key aspect of military climate engagements in particular, but of military practice in general and the war system in general, namely the central role played by arms producers, tech developers, different capital and venture investors of different kinds, and a large chain of military industrial suppliers and financial shareholders, without whom war's technological foundations would crumble. But these are actors who not only make war materially possible, but who amass vast fortunes because of its perpetuation. And I think we need to carry in mind that also with the military sort of climate work, those actors are front and center, and those interests are also front and center. And this brings me to my third and final part, what to make of all this. And I'll pose four sort of questions to help us think through and problematize military climate claims. And of course, there are myriad ways in which you can problematize these, but I've chosen these for now. Firstly, what's in it for the imperial war machine, if we accept it as such, and its beneficiaries to go green? Secondly, what forms and sites of insecurity and harm and violence hide behind military approaches to security and sustainability and their ongoing linking? Thirdly, and relatedly, who is secured and who is rendered insecure, right, by military climate policy and strategy? And fourthly, what alternative understandings of and responses to security and sustainability do military climate strategies silence and foreclose, right? Another one of my favorite quotes. We'll get to that. To answer what's in it for the war system, I think for me it's relatively simple. By ensuring military sectors' continued encroachment upon climate governance, and by suggesting that there's material viability to greening military power, I argue that military climate efforts are designed to identify and optimize, right, the battlefield and business opportunities associated with the climate changing world and with the industrial green transition or energy transition. And Rolls-Royce, former president of defense, puts this imperative in plain text for us when he says, decarbonization is a warfighting opportunity for industry and its customers. And its customers are largely state and militaries, right? And within this logic, ecological responsibility is effectively warped into an opportunity for war and wealth making. for maintaining and advancing the lethality and the profitability of European military actors and military power. And cast in military-industrial terms, energy is redefined as capacity, sustainability as strategy, and green technologies become capabilities that you deploy on a battlefield. A process which drags ecological care into European fantasies of both military dominance and of so-called ethical forms of warfare, right, that we've seen for generations that these actors are trying to promote, while effectively conflating climate action with a military mandate to, quote, fight and win anytime and anywhere. And evident here is also the extent to which military climate engagements focus on adapting to the effects of ecological degradation, right, while ignoring or obscuring root sources. And this strategic, I think it's a strategic choice. Reactionary surface level focus allows the war system and its beneficiaries to avoid exposure as drivers rather than solutions to collapse, right? And this leads me to the question of what violent relations that hide behind armed forces and arms companies, promotion as disaster responders, as environmental stewards, and as decarbonization champions in different ways that we've seen in the presentation. And in effect, this promotion depends on the omission or denial of the vast harms to lives and lived environments generated by the production and maintenance of military power across war and peacetime, as well as by the so-called green solutions on which military decarbonization relies. And in contrast to their rosy self-branding as net zero champions, there's still a huge gap in reported data on militaries and arms companies' carbon costs. They are still exempt from reporting this data globally, and their emission reduction efforts, surprise, surprise, are nowhere near required levels. If you ask someone like me, they need to be abolished for them to be required levels, but that's a different question. And amid increasing military spending and weapons procurement, which is what we're seeing now across the US and across Europe or across the world, actually, military emissions are obviously on the rise, rather. And a study by Transnational Institute, which is, I'd really recommend you to look at their incredible research, estimates that a 25% increase in NATO military expenditure between 2021 and 2024 has already corresponded with an increase in military emissions of 40%. And I think more importantly, military's expanded use of lower carbon energy sources is obviously happening alongside a persistent lock-in with hydrocarbons. Demand for fossil fuel hungry weapon systems, both sort of late and next generation technology, is only growing. And we see that artillery, missile, and explosives and other arms factories are actually expanding at triple speed across Europe compared to pre-2022 levels. Strikingly and worryingly, however, this militarization process is undoing years of efforts to impose environmental safeguards on weapons production in order to rearm Europe at scale and at pace. So environmental sort of legislation around arms production it's being deregulated, also at scale and pace at the moment. Oh, wow, I'll speed up. And still we're being told that rearmament is actually a precondition for ensuring Europe's, quote, stable and sustainable future. Should I stay here? Yeah, I'll stay. Military actors also, I think it's important to note, obviously centrality to fossil power and ongoing contribution to global warming then shines a perverse light, right, on their claims as humanitarian first responders. What we see here is a self-serving loop in which militaries demand more resources to intervene in disasters at which they have effectively co-produced. And by expanding military disaster responses, we expand the sources of disaster. And besides emissions, the production and use of military technologies also have serious costs for human and ecosystemic health across their life cycles. If we trace these life cycles, we learn, for example, how European military power connects devastated families in Gaza with cobalt miners in the Democratic Republic of Congo, with uranium miners in Niger, with explosive factory workers in Poland, with electronic waste recyclers in Ghana, right? And these communities and these territories are brought together, weaved together in a global web of harm that we very seldom hear about. And in contrast to the promise of sustainable war, attempts to green these military technologies are not mitigating, but rather expanding these costs by effectively feeding into the similarly destructive life cycles of lower carbon tech. And the industrial scale production of electric, digital, lower carbon, and alternative, both synthetic and biofuel technologies, rely on the continued externalization of harm and the centralization of revenue and profit, and the sort of creation and spread of various sacrifice zones. And these zones include the territories where mega wind, solar, and hydrogen power plants dispossess local communities, like in Mexico, Morocco, and Namibia, or where data centers consume local water sources, like in Ireland and the US desert. I won't linger in these costs, however, because in Xander Dunlap's talk with the series, I think in 2 weeks, you're going to learn a lot more about what the sort of unsustainable backdrop to the sustainable technologies that we're using today at scale, when they're being used at scale. I think what's important to note for now is obviously that these chains of harm, both from military industrial production, but also green industrial production, is entirely unaccounted for in military climate policy. Let's see how much I'm going to skip some stuff here, and we can do that in question and answers. But I'll highlight 2 key issues that emerge from this picture of the ecological costs of both war and greening. And firstly, we're seeing obviously that military climate efforts are increasing the misallocation of resources away from social and ecological needs towards death, domination, and destruction. And what we see is that to decarbonize military equipment and operations, you need a lot more resources than what you do for decarbonizing civilian infrastructure of different kinds. And secondly, European concerns for national climate, energy, and supply chain security are here revealed rather as sources of insecurity, right, and harm for the many population groups that are designated as expendable or disposable to the achievement of a net zero military. Stop me when you need. And that leads me to my second to last point. Who is secured and who is securitized, right? And while military actors across Europe gain recognition as ecological stewards, those surviving and resisting ecological degradation are instead actually cast as Europe's greatest threats, such as foremost migrants, land and water defenders of different kinds, as well as resistant movements engaged in various forms of abolitionist struggle. And in the UK, we've seen, for instance, that climate protesters have been arrested and charged at almost 3 times the rate of far-right activists during 2019 to 2025. And meanwhile, many European states are also becoming laboratories for the criminalization of solidarity, right, with people facing occupation and genocide, like Palestinians, often as a result of European arms export. And this repression includes increases in protest bans, suppression of free speech, mass surveillance, police brutality, public smear campaigns, and deportation threats. And in only 2 months in the UK, 4 times as many people were charged under the Terrorism Act for supporting a pro-Palestinian direct action group than during the 24 years of the so-called war on terror. And I think that's quite the striking statistic. So in effect, the normalization of militaries and arms industries as socially and ecologically responsible actors who, quote, drive green and social transition is happening alongside the violent repression of resistance against the militarist, extractivist, and imperial relations at the heart of ecological collapse. I'm very soon now. And I think, however, this is an important slide as well, that the intensifying repression of resistance might tell us something about just how much the present day beneficiaries of collapse stand to lose if things were otherwise. And we need not look far for this otherwise. Along the web of harm constituting the military green transition live myriad local and global struggles for dignified futures as people resist the processes by which imperial, industrial, and ecological iterations of modernity render their bodies and lands disposable. What can we learn about security and sustainability by listening not to the makers of war, but to, for instance, the hundreds of organizations that came together across 85 countries in September of last year to draw, quote, the line against inequalities, tyranny, genocide, destruction, and chaos, and for rights, jobs, justice, democracy, and a fulfilling life on a safe planet. What can we learn about the sources and solutions of climate change and conflict by paying attention instead to the projects that prefigure alternative with human and ecosystemic relations? And for answers to these questions, we can look, for instance, to this Draw the Line campaign that I highly recommend you to Google, or to the other lectures given within this series, where Tiara Naputi maps indigenous, feminist, and environmental justice responses to US militarization and ecological destruction across Pacific archipelagos, or where Todd Miller asks how we can deal with climate displacement, not by building wars, but by funding local adaptation strategies such as gabions in the Philippines, and where Diana Ojeda foregrounds the restoration, care, and defense of mangrove ecosystems as a form of ecological resistance and Black liberation in the Colombian Caribbean. I'm going to skip my final example, but it's called Casa Pueblo, and we can talk about it another day. Can I give my final two? Super. To wrap this all up, since I'm already late, I'm very sorry. Where does this all leave us as researchers and organizers? And of course, there are a million or myriad conclusions that we can draw here and critiques that we can make. But two key challenges that I carry with me relate firstly to the need for finding creative ways of deconstructing military actors' consistent, persistent, enduring attempts to monopolize rationality, realism, and objectivity. At this time of intensifying and converging military, social, and ecological disasters, it remains essential to undermine military claims as neutral observers, right, or responders to insecurity of any kind. And secondly, and relatedly, we need to keep pushing for visions and versions of the just transition framework, or transitions in plural, that adequately reckon with the imperial war machine and its beneficiaries. And this involves stubborn efforts to evidence and foreground militaries and arms industries' enduring roles as sources of collapse, right? As ecological predators, as I'd like to put it, rather than stewards. In short, if anyone's still unsure, green bombs will neither save us nor the planet, quite the opposite. I won't touch this. Now, I believe I ran over a little bit, so maybe we don't have 20 minutes, but at least 15 minutes for questions and answers. And I'm really looking forward to your comments and your questions. And will be, if you want to say something in the room, just raise your hand and you will be given a mic. And on Zoom, please use the question and answer function. And yeah, and hold the mic really close. For the people in the room, hold the mic really close.
Right. Hi, that was really fascinating. Thank you. My question and comment, I don't really know what it is, but, or if it's a question or if it's a comment, but I feel like what landed for me is that there's a really big mental health epidemic. And I feel like we all witness like smaller violences and smaller war day to day. Do you think, or what would it look like if we like channeled money and resources into mental health education, like especially for men who are seeking power and who are feeling small, and who need to find, power through violence? I guess my question is like, is it possible to like channel that money into like local mental health education? And do you think that's even realistic at this stage? Thank you.
Right. Yeah, well, the way my brain works, I'd rather answer this question immediately. Can I? And then we'll take one question at a time if that works. That's an excellent question that I have my own answers to, right? And within the current political and economic social context, I don't think that we're going to see more investment in mental health or social security, insecurity, well-being of any kind, right? Which is exactly what would be a solution, what would be a preventative measure, what would be a mitigating measure. And that's obviously where we should be putting our money. I don't think that would happen, but I love this question because from my experiences in these arms fairs, engaging with a lot of men who would need a lot of mental support, as in like who, how do I put this? Right. A lot of men who I think if they had had more support and care at different points in their lives, and these are many of them are also veterans and soldiers who have lived through incredibly devastating things during war, if they had had any type of support and sort of larger communities of care and nurtureship, even if that's a shrink or a family member or friends, at any point in time during that period, I think the world would be a better place. Like, I really do. Because I don't think that we are evolutionarily wired towards violence and competition and self-aggrandizement. I think that that comes from different sources of harm. And so I really agree that harm reduction would be, yeah, the key there. Thank you.
And at the front, and then I'll move further back.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. I really enjoyed the altitude of like you explaining your slides. I had a question on like how to combat or not to combat, to I guess acknowledge like environmental racism, like in cases like Hurricane Katrina or like places in I think certain places in Memphis, if I'm not mistaken, with the AI and like specifically grow something with Elon Musk and X and the machines that are like either it's like noise pollution and also like air pollution in general from the machines and also water pollution that can't be like reused or and it's using fresh water, so it's depleting our water reserves and making it less accessible for people to have clean drinking water. And I was wondering if you had like any like thoughts on how to combat that, either like through grassroots or something we could do in general to like, I guess, give more attention like from the government, or we could do ourselves, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. Just there's so much background noise here. So just so that I heard you correctly, the sort of the racial underpinnings, right, of where some of these factories are based, either we like weapons factories, but also AI, artificial intelligence, data centers, etc. You mean there's sort of the industrial racism, right, that we see with these processes? Yeah. There are loads of, I've learned a lot from a lot of sort of researcher, organizer type collectives, for instance, some that work in the US, who I think are called the Black Ecologies Network, Black Ecology something, as in I've learned so much from local communities who are both sort of academics and scholars and activists and organizers of different kinds who really labor with evidencing these processes, right? And really try to raise awareness in different kinds of how these processes affect communities differently. And obviously how this is a strategic choice, right? Because a more well-off white community would not allow the data center to eat up their local resources in the same way. So I would go to the existing resources. I would try to spread them in any way that you can, maybe as a student in university or through media, through other campaigns, right? I know I'm on film, but there are also direct action alternatives. Like there are a lot of people who target factories of different kinds in different ways. And I'll say no more on that. But there are so many ways, I think, for us to resist as both as organizers, more sort of grassroots organizers on a social material level, but also as knowledge generators, right? Or as people who generate and spread and create or share knowledge in different ways. And I think we should use that as a strategy for struggle as well, and especially to make that kind of, yeah, the uneven distribution of harms that we of course never hear about when this is our national security system, right? These weapons keep us safe. These AI models are ensuring the sustainable progress of our economy. Like these, all of those the grand narratives that were being sold on a national and global scale of how these technologies do good, really to penetrate through that debate somehow, publicly, privately, socially, with those facts of the differentiated harm, I think is really key. So go do it.
Thank you.
So I know you remarked on the kind of history of the use of environmental destruction deliberately in conflict. I think it was called war wilding, like in Vietnam and in Gaza. And I was wondering, how are those places and those effects present in the discussion of greening and sustainability in the military?
I'm trying to think if they are. Of course they are, I think to the extent that the military is quite happy to admit that the environment is a tool of war, right? For them, it is a weapon of war that is easily and happily deployed, and it has been during those moments. But the extent to which admission of the intergenerational harm from those processes, like the weaponized herbicides during the Vietnam War, or the actual use of ecocide, the large-scale use of ecocide in Gaza and by Russia and Ukraine at the moment, I haven't seen much admission or recognition of the intergenerational large-scale harm of that, right? Except for the ways in which they were strategic tools for warfare at that point in time. So rather, what we see now, well, the sort of the decades of, or let's put it this way, the mechanisms by which militaries and arms companies and policymakers have learned to obscure those harms and deny them, such as, for instance, the US military calling Agent Orange a safe weapon for decades and decades. I think those mechanisms, the narratives that they use, the ways in which they deflect accountability for that harm, that is now being reproduced with their greening strategies. So I think we see the sort of an indirect result of their lessons learned throughout these years of denying their environmental harm. And this is now being reproduced with their claims around biodiversity protection and electrifying their weapon systems and emissions reductions. Of course, next to that, there are also debates where the military actors are really present also in calling out other states' environmental harm. So we see, obviously, the US and UK, or maybe not the US at the moment, but several European powers who are calling out Russia's use of ecocide, right? And destruction of dams and destruction of forests. And when you flip the script, that's a really bad thing to do, right? Russia can't do these things. But I haven't seen in the same breath, right, the acceptance or acknowledgement of these states' similar use of the same harm. Yeah, does that answer?
We have an abundance of really excellent questions from our Zoom audience. I'll start with one from Andres Fabian Henao Castro, who says, "Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. With regards to alternative solutions, I was wondering if you could speak to the connection between the decolonial movement with its critique of settler colonial imperialism, the abolitionist movement with its critique of the prison industrial complex, the anti-war movement with its critique of the military industrial complex, with its critique of the role of and the ecological movement with its critique of the role of capitalism in the creation of climate change. Where do you see these movements intersecting at a global level?"
I think short answer to a very long question, they are intersecting loads. And just on a practical note, the movements that I am engaged in, different organizations sort of that spread across Europe, but also Global South in the US, those are the pillars of our engagement, right, with the war system and the war system's greening, right? So it's really at the intersection of those struggles that I think we're seeing the most effective critiques, the most effective knowledge and nodes of resistance being shared. And I think I've really seen, I think sort of back in the day, like when certain types of environmental and peace movements started flourishing, sort of 60s, 70s, back then it was really obvious that that was rooted in decolonial struggle. And it was rooted in Black liberation, and it was rooted in a sort of an incipient awareness of the power and the destructive capacities of the war system and all the money that was being made, sort of, that was circulated through that system. And so back then, I know that we would have these sort of incredible coalitions across continents where Swedish and British sort of white anti-nuclear women would create these coalitions and come to a lot of islands experiencing sort of in the Pacific archipelago, or also in the Caribbean, experiencing decolonization of different kinds. And you saw the enmeshment, the entanglement of those struggles and those critiques. And I think we lost that for a while, or in my whatever 30 years alive, not that I started doing this 30 years ago, but since I have become conscious of these struggles, I think we've seen a siloing, right, of those struggles, those critiques, those experiences of harm. And we've really seen that you're either in the climate movement, or you're in the peace movement, or you do social justice, or, you know, and it's only in the past 3-4 years that I at least have become witness to an incredible sort of a groundswell again of attempts to build bridges across those critiques and struggles and movements. I don't know if he was asking as to what all those different struggles mean and do, but I don't think I can explain that here now.
That was an excellent answer. Thank you. I think I'll ask another one from our Zoom audience. We have very many. So Nari Yun asks, as much as I agree that climatization of the military is more for the expansion of military and defense industry, it is also undeniable that more manpower will be needed due to the increased incidence of natural disasters. What could be some kind of negotiated solutions for the military to be an environmental governance actor more democratically and effectively? And I think personally, I'll just add on to that. What are some demilitarized ways of responding to natural disasters that you would like to see?
Well, that's obviously like one of the crucial questions where at the moment we are stuck with some of these institutions as the most capable, logistically, infrastructurally, technologically, monetarily capable forces. And in the here and now, we need them to respond to disasters, supposedly. Or of course. And my answer to that wouldn't be, the compromise would not be to expand their ability to respond to disasters, but to put that money in the creation or the buildup. I think we already have certain examples of this in Europe, but the boosting of civilian response mechanisms dead, right? There are a lot of people who can serve similar functions to the military in terms of having the discipline, the know-how, the logistical capacity, but who are not an armed force with a mandate to protect national security in a weapons-based sense, right? So I think for me, the compromise now, what we're seeing is that the military they have this huge, we need a growing collaboration across military and civilian agencies and departments so that we can respond well to disasters, right? But what we're seeing here is that the military is eating up more space in the civilian response infrastructure. And I'd say we should put that money in expanding the civilian infrastructure instead. But my favorite examples to answer your question on alternative response mechanisms is rather what you're seeing in terms of the locally rooted measures, right? Among either people who sort of in neighboring villages or coming from all over the country on a grassroots level, bringing whatever capacities they have, and they stay a lot longer, and they have a different relationship to the community on the ground. They have a different social, linguistic, of course the military maybe speaks the same language, but sometimes the military is actually foreign. So they have a different knowledge of the local conditions and the local people's needs. And we've seen this in, I think so many examples going around in my head. But for instance, across Latin America, there have been several, I think, with the huge earthquake in Toahantepec, where local communities really came together in the face of this and really resisted the sort of more superimposed, more harmful police and military response mechanisms as they tried to bring in these sort of more capitalist state-based solutions. And instead they built, started from the beginning, and they built this house with a kitchen how to put this? Anyhow, it's a better locally grounded and more long-term response that I think we're seeing from local communities and stuff.
Colleague of Nico's and is also really great and will continue to teach you more about this. Thank
It'll
you.
be worth it.